we have joining us for this session, the Global Indigenous Experiences Panel. We have Keshab Thapa, who will be talking about their experiences from Nepal, and we have a cancellation from Onel Masadrol. He's from the Gunalaya territory of Panama, and he couldn't join us because of technical difficulties. And we're just waiting for one more to join us, Alejandro Argumedo from Peru. But I think we're going to start, and once Alejandro can join us, he can join us. But I'm going to give the floor to Keshab to introduce himself and talk about the experiences of Nepal when dealing with pandemics in the past. Nepal, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Meryl. Hello, everyone. My name is Keshab Thapa. I'm from Nepal. I belong to Bagale Thapa group in Kshatriya community in Nepal. Um, so Nepal is always an independent nation, never colonized, and the context of indigenous categorization is a little bit different than in other contexts. So I belong to Kshatriya community, and this community is a privileged community, one of the privileged communities in Nepal, and has been in the key decision-making positions and administrations. So it's native to Nepal, but it's not listed as those communities under the indigenous groups, but it is still native to Nepal and that land. So Nepali context is it's a coexisting society living in cooperation and harmony with each other, and having own land and territories where the land share they're sharing land with each other and living in harmony at the community level. Currently, I'm in Winnipeg, Treaty 1 territory, which is the land of Anishinaabe, Ininu, Anishinaabe, Dakota, Dede, and the Métis peoples. And currently, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Manitoba. About Nepal, it has a lot of different factors that we need to consider talking about the pandemics and other issues. Nepal has diversity of peoples and ecosystem. We have nearly 125 different communities, different ethnic groups, and they have their own language. We have different religions. People have been historically following Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, and later on Christianity as well. So, and also there are communities who totally worship nature with no. So these different religious worldviews, the caste-based system, which has both positive as well as negative sides, and the sovereignty. These all factors are merging and shaping the Nepali community, dealing with different situations and pandemics. One example that was highlighted by the BBC as well is the Newari communities in the capital city, Kathmandu, Nepal. So Newari communities, they are very much involved in business activities. So they were the leading communities, and they still are the leading communities in business in Nepal. Historically, they would travel to Tibet when Tibet was a separate nation. Now it's controlled by China. So they would travel to Tibet for business purposes, and while they would return back from the trip, they wouldn't directly go and meet their family members. Instead, they would be taken to their community buildings where they would stay there for certain days, and then after they would um, come and visit their families. So there was a local response from the Newari community to deal with the different kind of pandemics, disease, and that way they would monitor and control the influx of different diseases into their communities. And still um, in Hindu culture, when somebody dies in a family, they have a mourning activities. So for that mourning, it goes for 13 days. So it's almost there's quarantine requirements like 14 days. So in that day, the family members, particularly the son and son-in-law of that deceased person, they have to remain in isolation, and they are not allowed to uh, touch anybody else. So that's another practice which is still going on, and I think this practice has to some extent many people, they may be taking the quarantine requirements in a way a little bit comfortable, although it's been challenging for many people because people are coming back to Nepal in a larger groups, particularly when COVID cases in India rose very abruptly. These are some of the practices, and there are other communities like there is a community, Rauti community. They still live in forest. They're still dependent on forest. They have their own governance system. They do not want to be settled like other communities out of the forest, and they consider forest is their land. So they have their own governance and government system, and they have their own practices, totally reliant on forest and land. And so at this time, even compared to other populations in Nepal, because of their land connection and isolation from the mainstream community, they should be relatively safe.
Yeah, I'm going to introduce the other guests. He just joined us. If you can put your camera on, Alejandro. Okay, Alejandro Amagoto is from Peru. If you can introduce yourself, Alejandro.
Hello, everyone, and apologies for being a bit late. I didn't realize that the time difference was that short. Anyhow, my name is Alejandro Argumedo. I'm a Quechua Indian from southern Peru, up in the Andes Mountain. I'm currently working as a director of programs at Swift Foundation, California-based philanthropy institution. And also member of the board of directors of Asociación Andes and international coordinator of the Mountain Indigenous Peoples.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go over a few questions. It's going to be very casual. I just got Dr. Keshab to talk about his country of Nepal, and maybe I can get you to talk about the experiences within your country and dealing with the impacts of COVID right now. Okay.
Okay. I think to talk about Peru and my own community, it'd be good to put this in the context of the region. You know, Latin America and the Caribbean region passed 1 million deaths on Friday. So this is according to One World Tally. So the region is worsening, but has perhaps the highest per capita death rate in the world. So if you see from the highlands of Bolivia to the Brazilian cities, the pandemic has just swamped the whole healthcare system, and continues to spread in the whole region. In Peru, in my own country, the pandemic hit perhaps the hardest in the region. Just yesterday, for instance, almost 20 people just passed away in overcrowded hospitals, in the corridors of hospitals in the capital city of Lima. Deep in the Amazon, in Peru, people are also being impacted. Madre de Dios is one of the places, and Iquitos, places where we have high incidence of people, dead people, but also of positive cases. But in all this, I think we have to note or underline that most of these cases are in cities, while in the Amazon have spread into communities. In the Andes itself, because of how communities have reacted. And this is the case of my own community in Cusco. Communities have used their own customary laws to institute their own bans and lockdowns. And because the fact that we are farming communities, and have been working and localizing our food systems, and the food system is connected to the health system, we don't have the type of underlying conditions that are or worsens the situation of COVID. So there's almost no cases of diabetes or heart type of diseases, even though we live in still farm above 4,000 meters sea level. That's very high. And no single case, for instance, exist in our communities. So we fenced well, even though the nearby cities have high incidence of cases, infections, and deathways. In the communities, there's no need to go out for food because there's food security due to the focus on food sovereignty over the last 10, 15 years. And the system itself of producing food is combined with producing medicinal plants. And this association, have in a way provided the possibility for people to not to depend on the cities, not to depend on Western medicines or supermarkets or industrial type of food. And also noting that the type of crops that we farm are indigenous crops, are traditional crops with high nutrient and vitamin content, like say quinoas, amaranthus, potatoes, native potatoes of different types of color that have high content of antioxidants. So all that we believe has been positive in the sense that have sheltered the communities biologically, physically, and also added to the less dependent type of economy of the communities where the non-monetary system is combined with a monetary system. And in this type of shocks, then the non-monetary system where you have different types of exchange systems like bartering, it's more relevant than the monetary system, which is cash based on the exchange value of the local currency, which changes very rapidly. And because of how, as you know, the market works, it depends on international trade from in terms of food, in terms of medicine, in terms of knowledge and resources. But in this other side, where the non-monetary system exists and works, then there's less dependency on these big fluctuations, and that provides a good cushion when this type of shocks comes in. So just to say that that's the kind of resilience the communities can offer as a lesson for other places in the world. Yeah.
You had touched on a very important point, food sovereignty, the monetary system, and the way Indigenous peoples need to go back to their own laws, customary laws. Those are very important points. Maybe I'll ask Keshab, can you talk about the customary laws as well within your country, Nepal?
Oh yeah, there are different laws and governance systems specific to the communities in Nepal. I could connect to what Alejandro was also saying, those barter system, community-based food production. Um, like in in my community, let me share you a picture of that area. So this is the village where I was born and raised in, and the context of land governance is that we have the land that is registered to each family. So it's I would say the private land. So these were the land that were historically used by our ancestors, but later on the land policy then they registered on each households, and then on around you could see the forest. So that's a community forest. So the community forest is managed by the community. They have a community committee with representation from the entire community. Not only these areas, but there are other clusters in that landscape. They're also part of that community forestry group, and then they they decide the governance of that community forest, like when to harvest, when to harvest those woods, and when to allow people to go and collect wild foods. For example, this time people are returning back home from city areas and also from outside the country, for example, India. So they have been to their land and they have gone to forest areas to pick up berries, to pick up wild fruits. So it's getting connected to the land, and also it's in the rural areas because of the isolation and because people know each other who came from outside and who has gone outside. Uh, they comparatively they are able to monitor who is going out and who is coming in, and the social setting, for example, for this is the time for maize farming, and then in July, in June, July, it's for millet farming as well as the rice farming. So they they barter labor. Actually, people from one household and other households from the community, they they work together for, let's say, finishing farming activity for my farm, and then next day another, and next day another. So that way, the labor, that the sharing of the work is um, revolving around the community. So it's less dependent on the outside market, except for some stuffs buying from the market, like those oils and onions, in some cases rice, sugar, because they have their own land, so they cultivate there, and they harvest the food from the land. So it's to some extent contributing to the food sovereignty and the exchange. Actually, it's not selling products in cash, so it's more like bartering. Let's say if I'm making a tea and I don't have sugar, maybe I go to my neighbor's house and then bring a cup of sugar, and then when I bring sugar at my house, and then I return that. So that way, it has been historically going on. So these systems are seen very much effective and very much helpful in time of pandemic like this. And those who are back to the community and they have explored the option of going back to land and managing land and getting food and other activities from land. So these are some of the practices and governance mechanisms. But I talked it's kind of a very generic because there are ethnic diversity, there are cultural diversity, so and also the geographic diversity from region to region. It also differs.
Yes, thank you. Both of you talk about on the sovereignty and the governance. Keshab, you talked about what they did before and during pandemics, and and for Alejandro, you talk about what they're doing right now in asserting their sovereignty. These are really important points. Maybe I'll start with Alejandro to go back again regarding the lockdowns. What your people, your community is doing regarding lockdowns and the way they assert themselves to be sovereign. And then I will go back to Keshab to talk about the historical side.
Yeah. Before I go into the details of how customary laws apply and how the governance of the communities work, I think it's important to go a little bit back in history. And we cannot, not to remember when this continent that's called the Americas were invaded. And people may call it contact, but it was an invasion that came with viruses, different types of diseases that our peoples didn't have the defense for. And this first big pandemic, smallpox and other types of diseases that in less than 10 years wiped out big civilizations, Aztecs, Mayas, Incas, North American sophisticated cultures. And on that is that colonial structures were established. And those colonial structures is what actually destroyed us and took away the tools, the mechanisms, and the ways we responded to big shifts like this pandemic. Remember that before the so-called contact, the Iroquois used to plan for 7 generations. In my country, we used to plan for a Pachacuti, which means 450 years. So in terms of long-term planning, our peoples were already very much developed in terms of responding to different types of, this big type of shifts and crises that would happen. It's not, far-fetched or removed from our own reality, because in the Caribbean, you have hurricanes that come and destroy cyclically. In the whole continent, we have El Nino that happens in different types of cycles. It happens every 6 years, every 28 years, every 90 years, and every 400 years. So our people knew that you have to have long vision, long-term planning, so that our next generations could plan. Then you have, the Spanish flu pandemic that also affected very disproportionately, like now, to indigenous peoples all over. But this is not because our biology or our physical makeup is weak. They tell us that. So the white people don't have to have responsibility. Then they don't want to be accountable. It is colonialism. It is abject poverty. It is land grabbing. It is big extractive industries which have created this type of situation and doesn't allow us, to have a strong response to it. So it's colonial power, it's colonial institutions that still act like it. It is the lack of land access. It is the grabbing of our seeds and the appropriation to intellectual property. It is the way education is implemented, removed from our own science, which little by little erodes that deep connection with the land and understanding of how natural medicines work. Now we are dependent on vaccines and Western medicine. We don't need that in many ways if you are isolated. The forest is your pharmacy, is your supermarket. So text, communities that have, contests of fight back the colonial institutions are those ones that are better off in this moment because they have the possibility to grow the food they want, to associate it with traditional medicines and continue to respond to the challenges that we have, and have a strong governance system that says nobody comes into this community and nobody can go to the city because you don't need much. If you need a bit of what is missing in the community, it will be through a special commission. And that's how customary laws work within communities that are called poor, are called whatever name, because they are not, and they have not been absorbed by the colonial society, where they want you to be labor force in the city, destituted of everything, of your culture, your knowledge, your way of organizing, and your deep respect, ceremony, and rituals that connect you to the land. All those are part of the strength that we have and the responses that we do. So, for instance, in the communities of the Potato Park that is located in Cusco, Peru, it's an association of 6 different tribes that brought together the lands to have a single governance of all of it in defense of an emblematic crop, which is the potato. The customary law says that when the governance of this place says nobody goes out, people continue to grow food, and they have to grow more because there's people coming into the community, escaping from the cities. And they established rules that they have to be tested. And when they come in, they have to be isolated for 3 weeks, and only then they can immerse back into the community. And people are coming because there is clean water, there is plenty of food. And last year, at the height of the pandemic, or the first wave, these communities took food from their harvest, different types of crops, potatoes, maize, etc., and took it to the city because people didn't have food in the city, particularly the elderly, shelters of women, single mothers, so that shows that when you keep those values of reciprocity, balance, solidarity that underpins the institutions or the community, then the response is not just for you as an individual, but you look also outside. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Those are very important comments. We're gonna come back to some of those comments that you just raised. But at this time, Keshab, can you talk about the customary laws too regarding the past experiences of Nepal when they went into lockdown or self-imposed lockdown?
Okay, so just I want to share a bit of historical context. When we talk about governance, the administration in Nepal, it's a small country, so it's very much influenced by what happens in our neighboring nations. For example, India, China, and also to the Western world as well, because Nepal was not directly colonized, but the international policies and what is happening around the country influences Nepal very much through the Nepali government system and policies. So, in terms of influencing the customary law institutions, the practices of Nepali people, it's not a direct control which is happening in many parts in the world. For example, Canada and Australia and other countries where the colonization is direct and ongoing. But in Nepal, it's through the mainstream government, the policies and the institutions. They are influenced, and they reach to the local level through different kind of interventions. But still, in terms of governing small communities by different communities and different indigenous practices, that is still evident. So it's like the power of the community or the power of the people is still very strong in Nepal. If let's say if let's say a community in a certain area in rural region, if they want to if they want outsiders not allow in their community, they could have that kind of rules, and they can practice their own governance systems. But they're also influenced by the mainstream government system. For example, in the capital city, where the Newari community, that's the main homeland of Newari community, they have their institutions like Guti, and so in that Guti, that represents their community, and each and every household becomes the member of that Guti, and then the Guti decides and can make decisions for managing certain communities which they are part of. And even in other communities like Gurung communities, Tamang communities, Sherpa communities, so their distribution in terms of geography is like this is the area for that community, and another area that's for another community. So that's very much enabling them to practice their own governance system. One example is in northern Nepal, in Mustang area, where a Thakali community is. They have their own chief, elected chief. Community elects the chief, and the chief uh, decides everything for the community in cooperation with the community members. Let's say if the Nepal government official have some program with that community, they need to collaborate with the chief, and without the chief's approval, they cannot implement their program. So it's unlike other nations where colonialism is very direct. In Nepal, it is still the community power that prevails, and to some geographic jurisdictions, local communities can have their own governance, can have their own customary law and practices. However, there are challenges, for example, in urban areas where the communities are mixed, and the main Nepali government, they have their main control, and they can implement the law and practices that they want. So overall, Nepal's governance, it's the community elected administrative system, but at the local level, each community can implement and have their own governance system, and that is informally in place in many communities. Like in my community, we don't have a very defined governance structure, but we have a system that is organized by our traditional ceremony. We call it Kul Puja, which happens every 5 years, and every household of our community, we have nearly 250 households in that area. So we are connected to that community through that ceremony. So that's one of our traditional governance mechanism through which everyone in the community is informed. So that's I would say that's one of the strong evidence of our ancestors, the Nepali ancestors, or the Nepali people who fought for colonial powers back in 1850s, and are able to at least have the current Nepal, although they lost nearly 40% of the land, but the current Nepal, which is still under own practices and governance. Although what happens globally, and capitalistic market, capitalism, imperialism, these are affecting, and the society is in the stage of what is in the stage of understanding what is good and what is bad. So it's very much challenging for balancing different forces, own practices as well as outside forces.
Thank you, Keshab. One of the issues that that was touched upon regarding the food system is the one that was touched upon by Alejandro. One of the presenters yesterday, we talked about the food system, and she mentioned that, for example, Canada, I would think of Canada as a rich nation, but the reality of COVID, I guess, in any country is that the food system is very fragile. And she was talking about she noticed that the food supply system is very fragile during this time. Can you elaborate within your own countries the food system, and for example, the way you talked about the food system in Peru, where your people went into the city to share their food, sell their food, and the impact, does it impact their own food system and the bartering system, and that's in place and everything? I'll start with Alejandro.
Yeah, I think my internet may be a little bit unstable, so I didn't hear well the question. But let me see. Let me elaborate a little bit. You see, in my country, more than 75% of the food that Peruvian eats comes from small farmers. So that means indigenous peoples that produce food and their farms feed the cities. The other 35% of the food is processed food that is imported
The internet is
US or other countries, which
the internet is
yeah, if I turn off my video, I may be better off. If you please, is that okay?
Meryl, you are muted.
Hello?
It's good. You're good to go.
Yeah. Let me move towards where I have a, I think, better internet connection, and I do apologize because that small farmers. Those small farmers are largely indigenous peoples. Now, this I have to contextualize by the history of agriculture and food systems, particularly in Peru. You know, the Incas are well known for having have one of the most sophisticated food systems in the whole continent. You know, terrace agriculture, most of the crops that we know in this region were domesticated there. Plenty of different types of associations between lower land crops and highland crops, from potatoes to oxalis to amaranthus, maize. So for each range in the altitude, we have different cropping system. So this provides us with the possibility of interconnecting lower parts of our mountain ecosystem with higher parts. So, and this combination produces very important results. Like in the upper part, we have cropping systems that focus more on potatoes and starchy crops, root crops. In the middle ground, you have maize, quinoa, and other type of grains that are grown there, largely in between 3,000 and 1,000 meters. And in the lower part, you have all types of fruits and other types of, we call it warm crops. And if you see more closely, the upper part are starch, carbohydrates, the middle part are proteins, and the lower part with the fruits and mostly vitamins. And people exchange those from the upper part, all the the carbohydrates move down, vitamins move up, proteins move up and down, and in each one of those ranges, it's complemented by small animals. So you have a very integral, a holistic approach of how we see food. So when the pandemic came in, those type of exchanges were cut. Nonetheless, because we are in a mountain ecosystem, there's microsystems that work, and we have barter markets. So people go and exchange to those places to get the food they need from the lower part or from the upper part. Most of those barter markets functions in the middle ground. So while the cities were cut from the farmers that provide the food, farmers and communities have plenty of food, mostly, unless they have been absorbed by the urban system. Then people depend on industrialized food. And what happens with industrialized food? They are made of GMOs, they are made with lots of sugars, they are made with all types of additives, and the result is high incidence of cholesterol, diabetes, heart disease, and those are the preconditions of COVID. So that's why COVID is more extended in the cities than in the countryside. In the countryside, in the communities that I know, my own, there is plenty of food, enough food, because yes, you are cut from the cities where sugar may come, or other types of key products, but you have the most important type of food sources in terms of proteins, in terms of carbohydrates, in terms of vitamins, complements of different types of minerals that came with medicinal plants that we use as additives to our food. So that type of food system that is localized, where from production to distribution, it's not dependent largely on money, but on exchanges that enrich the possibility to have access to food is good.
Keshab, you want to follow up?
Yeah, definitely. In Nepal, it's in urban areas. It's more challenging for those who have less opportunities. For example, there are peoples who need to depend on their daily income, labor source for fulfilling their food security. So with this pandemic, a lot of let's say lockdown. For example, the country has been in lockdown since 2 weeks. So it's still uncertain how long it will go. So those kind of populations, they are more affected, and they are having problems with access to food and purchasing capacity. But overall, the context is like, let's say, in my community, in back in the village, uh, people grow millet from their own land. They grow corn or maize from their own land. They never buy millet. They never buy a corn. They grow rice. So it's something in terms of geography pretty much similar to, I guess, Peru, what Alejandro was saying. So they have land for growing rice. They have land for growing legumes. They have land for growing corn, millet. So it's a very diverse production system. It is subsistence, but it is under the control of many of the community members. So they have control over the land, and they have control over what to produce, and how to harvest that, and how to store that. So in rural areas, it is also, COVID has also brought a situation of thinking about growing growing more food from a local food production system, and relying less on market food. But still, it goes back to the historical events. I think in day one, Dr. Denetel was talking about boarding school system and the education system in the US. Uh, Even in Nepal, the boarding school system and the the education system that was more suitable for bringing people from countries like Nepal to outside, that has affected the overall food production dynamics in Nepal. So uh, even at this time, many youth, they attend, who attend boarding schools, they have less connection to land and less connection to their language and culture. So that way, that they are having disconnected to their roots. Minkat Lepsa was also sharing, youths are, in a way, they need counseling. So this historical and the global forces are trying to break the local food sovereignty and production system. But this COVID situation has, to some extent, provided a lesson that, oh, we need to grow locally, we need to try to be self-reliant. And many Nepali people, they work in India, they work in other countries, like in Middle East. They've returned back, and this has also affected the purchasing capacity of their families. Usually, this is one of the challenges that we're having. Youth are going outside of the country for earning cash, so which is a which is a result of this capitalistic global economy. They're sending cash, and the families back home, they are buying from the market, especially in urban areas, and also in rural areas. But now, from Middle East and in India, because of this COVID cases, they're back, and they're having less cash with hand. So this has resulted in the situation of crisis, as well as those who are back to the rural areas. Now they are trying to explore what they can do on their own land. So there are some good lessons, but many challenges and stresses. But I think from connecting to the land and food sovereignty perspective, getting more from the land and getting sustainable with less reliant on this, let's say, fertilizers, chemical fertilizers, and hybrid seeds. I think this would provide a sustainable path and help the community to achieve self-sufficiency during the time of pandemic like this.
Yeah. We have 5 minutes. We have 5 minutes for questions. If you have any questions, I put them in the chat, and I'll ask Keshab and Alejandro. It was a very good discussion. We learned from Nepal, and Peru. One of the comments is that that's so wonderful. The non-monetary system is combined with the monetary system. When people are disassociated from their connections to biodiversity, the dependence on the industrial system accelerates. What are the challenges of communicating the benefits of indigenous ways of knowing and being part of the planet? Okay, I'll start with Kshapa, then we'll turn it over to Alejandro.
So some of the challenges, it's what I feel is that when I came here in Canada and when I learned, when I heard from indigenous community members, elders, researchers, so here is what I find is it's more value of the traditional or indigenous system and way of knowing, but in our context, because we didn't face direct colonial forces. So what, in general, what the Nepali society is thinking that, oh, we are always a sovereign nation. We are proud of that, and but we have more like influence from our education system and the market, that our knowledge, what our elders know, what we practice locally, these are kind of, we feel like these are kind of inferior. So if I get education and then if I go back to my land and start farming, then that I would consider, oh, that's kind of something what I'm not supposed to do. So it's kind of inferiority, which is influencing the thought process of many youth in Nepal. So, but what we realized that in pandemic, although the Western medicine has not that much encouraged that, but in pandemic, many Nepali people, irrespective of where they are living, they are regularly having a drink that they make from turmeric and boiling in hot water and other medicines which are collected from land. So this is, I would say, yeah, there are many challenges with this pandemic, but some kind of realization that, oh, there is something important in our system. We
Yeah.
need to also explore that, besides getting vaccines and besides getting the research information from.
Thank you. We have 1 minute left, and I want to hear from Alejandro real quick. Alejandro?
Yeah, I think one of, I mean, there's many challenges how to communicate, but I would say perhaps the strongest trait that indigenous peoples have can be able to share with the rest of the world is the deep connection to the land, to respect to Mother Earth, the spiritual aspects of it. And that must be connected to policy. It should inform policy and form policy so that the world can change its behavior.
Okay, thanks a lot. I really appreciate your insights, and I really appreciate your agreeing to come on. We have to wrap it up. It's already 12:30. There's another session that's going to start right away. And thank you again, Keshab and Alejandro.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Yeah!